Imagine having the power to lead your own army, engage in thrilling battles, conquer other races, and build a mighty fortress. That's exactly the opportunity our hero finds himself with, thanks to the Almighty Lord system. This system gives him the ability to develop his warriors, unlock new technologies, and embark on epic conquests. From capturing fortresses to fighting for territories, encountering various unique races, and engaging in battles so intense they'll leave you breathless. This story has it all. It all begins with Richard, our protagonist, who arrives in the bustling city of Solon. After being transported to this world, Richard awakens in the body of a bastard from the prestigious Orlando family. His reasons for being in Solon are many, but this is where his adventure, filled with ambition and power, truly begins.
Richard has many reasons for being in this city. He hopes to start a new chapter in his life here, armed with the system of the Supreme Overlord. Upon arriving at the City Lord's chambers, he learns the bad news that his father, Calvin Orlando, has died. Richard's half-brother, Winger Orlando, now sees him as a threat, but Richard remains indifferent. The Lord, glaring, demands that Richard give up the Orlando name and assist Winger in removing any obstacles. If Richard agrees, Winger will give him 500 gold coins to support his new territory. When a box is presented to him, Richard opens it to find a pile of gold coins. A satisfied smile crosses his face as he realizes this will be perfect as the starting capital for his new life. Relieved that a deal has been made, the Lord relaxes. But Richard isn't content with just the money. He calmly states that the Orlando name holds great honor and glory, the most valuable legacy left by his father. Surrendering it would require more compensation. The Lord, momentarily taken aback, quickly offers 1,000 gold coins with no interest, on the condition that Richard buys everything from the city. Richard agrees and asks if the Lord has a group of barbarian Highlander slaves in the Colosseum. The Lord, understanding Richard's plan to use them as troops, warns that taming these barbarians will be difficult. Even with 1,000 gold coins, they might not obey him. Richard, having done his homework, is undeterred. The Lord then orders his men to escort him to the arena. As he rides in the chariot, he reflects on his 10 years of life in this world, sometimes missing his once happy life. When a servant asks about the tune he is humming, he vaguely replies that it's just a simple song from his hometown. The scene shifts to a deeper exploration of Richard's past. He was once homeless, killed as a thief, and discarded like trash. After reincarnating, he took over the host's body and acquired the mighty Lord system, growing stronger each day. Initially, he aimed to become a knight, but his father's sudden decision to pass on his title to Richard disrupted those plans. Fortunately, he obtained the certificate of pioneering lordship in time and fled to Solon City, escaping his family's wrath. At the Colosseum, he informs the owner that he wants to purchase all the barbarians to form troops and expand his territories. The owner, thrilled at the prospect of a large sale, eagerly leads them inside. As they walk through the corridor, the owner warns him that the barbarians are fierce and often injure other fighters, costing her a fortune in medical expenses. She advises caution, but his interest only grows as he observes the monstrous creatures lining the corridor. His excitement peaks when the owner mentions that the barbarians can slaughter and eat crocodiles. Impressed by their self-sufficiency and fighting prowess, his determination to subdue the powerful Lord system on the continent. As he reviews the system's attributes, he feels ready to showcase the results of his hard work over the past 3 years. Reaching the high platform of the Beast Arena, he loudly announces to the barbarians below that he has purchased all of them. Knowing they won't easily submit, he proposes a wrestling match. The winner gains freedom, while the loser becomes his subordinate. A hulking barbarian named Russell steps forward to challenge him. Muscles bulging with power, Russell prepares for the match. Meanwhile, the platform owner, drenched in sweat, fears the repercussions if anything happens to Richard on her territory. She quickly orders her attendants to persuade him to reconsider, but he insists he is following the City Lord's orders and has no right to interfere. As Richard braces for the fight, the barbarians mock him, laughing at the little boy who dares to challenge Russell. One even warns Russell to go easy, fearing problems if the aristocrat dies, but Russell is determined to show no mercy. The fight begins with Russell charging at Richard, headbutting him with brutal force. He grabs Richard by the shirt and slams him to the ground with a resounding bang. As Richard lies on the ground, Russell sneers, disappointed that it took only one move to defeat him. The barbarians cheer while the platform owner despairs, fearing her Colosseum might be shut down for good. But then, Richard grabs Russell's foot and slowly stands up with a smug grin. He had let Russell make the first move, not wanting to be accused of bullying. With a powerful punch to Russell's stomach, he sends the barbarian crashing to the ground. Russell, stunned, struggles to comprehend how an aristocrat could withstand his attacks. Meanwhile, Richard begins radiating a golden fire, a skill honed over the years through the Lord system. How could he lose to someone with such poor skills? Enraged, Russell charges again, but this time Richard effortlessly flips him over his shoulder and slams him to the ground. Now Russell finds himself pinned under Richard's foot, unable to believe he has been bested by a thin aristocrat. Refusing to admit defeat, Russell stands up, determined to re-challenge Richard. Calm and confident, Richard agrees to another round. The other barbarians can't bear to watch. Russell stubbornly refuses to tap out. The other barbarians urge him to surrender, pointing out that he has already lost 10 times. Even Russell is shocked at the outcome. Just then, a female barbarian steps forward, proposing a fight with Richard. As the leader of the barbarians, she seeks to free her people by defeating him. Richard, excited by the challenge, declares that the real show is about to begin. Gunther, the barbarian leader, attacks with lightning speed, catching Richard off guard. Suddenly, the system alerts Richard. The barbarian leader, named Gunther, has been detected as a hero. Distracted by the alert, Richard is hit by Gunther's steel fist, forcing him to stumble back. Despite standing his ground, Richard is curious about Gunther. He has never encountered a hero of her rank before. But Gunther doesn't give him time to recover, launching a relentless series of strikes. The barbarians cheer wildly, and even Richard's followers feel uneasy. Gunther's assault is just the beginning. She picks up a massive rock, worries that a lord has just been stoned to death in her arena. Gunther stands proudly, but then a voice emerges from beneath the rock, shocking everyone, including Gunther. Richard pushes the rock away, and Gunther swiftly moves to his side, wrapping an iron chain around his neck and slamming him to the ground. Richard doesn't struggle but seems satisfied with Gunther's performance. With a light pull, he snaps the chain apart, shocking the barbarians. Even Gunther is stunned. Top craftsmen forged this chain to restrain giant beasts, and even she had been trapped by it for years. Yet Richard broke it effortlessly with his bare hands. Impressed by her strength and strategy, Richard sees Gunther as the perfect subordinate, but Gunther feels mocked. Furious, she demands that Richard respect her and give his all in their battle. Richard calmly replies that she is still chained, unable to fully unleash her power. Now, it is his turn to show what he is truly capable of. He raises his right fist, gathering strength, and lunges forward, his fist slicing through the air. Gunther blocks, but Richard follows with a crushing overhead strike. The ground shatters on impact, and Gunther barely dodges. The barbarians watch in awe as their chief is overwhelmed by Richard's strength. Suddenly, Richard grabs Gunther's throat. She struggles but can't break free. As Richard raises his left hand to strike, Gunther closes her eyes, expecting the end. But instead of hitting her, he shatters the iron ring on her body. Stunned, Gunther's heart races as she processes what just happened. After taking down the female leader, Richard turns to the barbarians and gives them a choice. They can continue challenging him or choose to follow him. Richard extends his hand as a sign of cooperation. Gunther takes his hand and stands up, declaring that Richard is now their new leader. Richard announces that he will become the Supreme Lord and needs their strength to grow together. The barbarians, initially uncertain, eventually shout their agreement to join him, follow his orders, and call him their boss. Amidst the cheers, Richard receives a prompt from the system. As he looks at the flood of requests to join his team, Richard realizes he has officially taken the first step in his journey toward becoming the Supreme Lord. But the journey through this wild world is fraught with chaos and bloodshed. Countless ambitious individuals have risen to become lords, crafting their own realities. Yet, most of them met their end in despair, leaving this world behind. Though Richard eagerly anticipated his future adventures, he knew it wouldn't be wise to stroll through the streets with a group of half-naked barbarians. So, he led them to the city's equipment store. As they entered, the barbarians were as excited as children, marveling at the dazzling array of gear. Richard, however, didn't even glance at the display. He went straight to the owner, Negan Dwarf, explaining that he was there to outfit his brothers, having heard that the shop offered top-quality weapons. Sensing he was dealing with an expert, the owner pressed a button on the wall. The building's walls rotated, revealing an impressive arsenal of weapons. Richard asked the owner to equip each of his men with a lance and 3 throwing spears. After a quick calculation, the owner informed him that the total cost would be 750 gold coins, but Richard only produced a few gold coins. The owner, sneering with contempt, was about to press the button to close the door and dismiss him, mocking him for being poor. Gunther, seeing this, began to protest, but Richard calmly told her to wait. He then pulled out a legendary piece of equipment, the Dragon Slayer sword, and handed it over. The owner, trembling with excitement, realized that the man before him must be someone important to possess such a weapon. He immediately agreed to let Richard purchase everything on credit. Richard returned the sword and instructed the barbarians to take a lance, 3 throwing spears, and leather armor each. Negan Dwarf couldn't refuse and ordered his employees to quickly equip everyone. The barbarians, now armed and outfitted, were ecstatic. At this point, Gunther approached Richard and asked about their next move. Richard smirked and said they were about to claim a land that rightfully belonged to them. As Richard and his group set out to find a territory, someone watched them from afar through binoculars. It was the Goblin Chief, Harrison. Beside him stood the Gnoll Chief, whose jackal army was ambushed on a nearby hill. They were eager to loot the supplies and weapons from Richard's troop. The Gnoll Chief was impatient to attack, confident in their numbers, which outmatched Richard's group 5-1. But Goblin Harrison, assuming Richard was brainless, ordered them to hold off until Richard's group ventured deeper into the hinterland. Meanwhile, Gunther had already sensed that something was off. She reported her suspicions to Richard, who was aware of the possibility of a monster ambush. She asked if he had a plan. Richard turned to his group and commanded them to halt. He instructed them to form a circle with the carriages, securing the livestock and goods inside in preparation for an imminent attack. Without delay, he retrieved a bag of pills and distributed them, explaining that these were oriental elixirs designed to enhance their strength. He urged them to take the pills quickly and get ready for the battle ahead. Most of the group swallowed the pills immediately, while a few remained skeptical. Richard reassured them, insisting that their boss was trustworthy. In truth, the pills were nothing but flower balls, a ruse to cover up the power of the Lord system. Richard opens the system panel and sees that most of the barbarians are third-level spearmen, except for Gunther, who stands out as an independent hero unit. The system is incredibly powerful, making it possible for units to level up quickly through constant battles. If the barbarians had figured this out, it could have caused a riot, so Richard cleverly used dumplings as a distraction. Holding a magic pill in his hand, he whispers that soon everyone will experience its power. Meanwhile, the goblins and jackals watching them notice the barbarians have stopped moving. The Gnoll declares that it's time for their enemies to die. The Golden Chief punches him in the chest, questioning why he seems so pleased. The Gnoll guesses the barbarians might be protected by something sacred, but the Goblin chimes in, saying the barbarians have stopped because they're scared of the Goblin's strength and have decided to surrender. Unimpressed, the Gnoll yells that they don't care about that and commands his troops to attack and loot the barbarians. As the monsters charge down from the hill, Richard quickly orders his army to get ready for their first battle. The Gnoll, eager for bloodshed, instructs his forces to kill everyone before taking any loot. The fight is about to break out, with both sides gearing up for the clash. Richard grabs a spear and hurls it at the approaching enemy with incredible speed. The spear cuts through the air, heading straight for Chief Harrison. He easily deflects it by raising his armored arm, and the spear flies off, piercing a goblin's skull in the distance. Harrison tells his army that while their opponents are strong, they aren't strong enough to be feared. He shouts to his men that they outnumber the enemy by a wide margin and urges them to attack all at once. Richard's side is clearly at a disadvantage because of the difference in numbers. The barbarians start to lose confidence and doubt their abilities. One of them mutters that no matter how strong they are, they can't possibly defeat such a large army. A jackal attacks, but one of the barbarians knocks it down with a punch. Another barbarian stabs a jackal in the stomach with his weapon. The jackals, being relentless, start killing the barbarians. A massive goblin fights several barbarians at the same time. Russell and another barbarian find themselves surrounded by goblins and jackals. Russell swings his weapon at the jackals, calling them dogs, but 3 jackals attack him at once. Meanwhile, another giant goblin grabs a barbarian with one hand and squeezes him so hard that the barbarian's body bursts like a bubble. Gunther sees what's happening and asks Richard what they should do. Richard orders Gunther to hand him another spear. Then he attaches a flaming spearhead and launches it at a troll on the other side. The spear hits its mark, killing the troll instantly and frightening the other monsters, causing them to retreat. At the same time, the successful attack boosted the morale of Richard's side. With the system's blessing on their side, the barbarians began to fight more bravely. Suddenly, Russell also stood up, slamming the jackals that pounced at him. Just then, the Gnoll Chief appeared behind him, ready to deliver a fatal blow, but Richard had already thrown a spear that pierced through the Gnoll Chief's body. Right after that, Richard drew his Dragon Slayer sword and shouted that the leaders of the bandits were dead and that the enemy had lost their fighting spirit. He urged his men to take advantage of this moment and launch a full-scale attack. Encouraged by his words, the barbarians' spirits soared, and they started to dominate the battle. Gunther realized that Richard had been targeting the enemy leaders all along, and that standing on the carriage gave him a better view of the battlefield. Richard quoted an old saying, "To capture bandits, first catch the leader." Now, only Chief Harrison's army remained, the ones who had originally planned the ambush. The goblin clenched his teeth, calling the barbarians a bunch of losers and ordinary people, urging them to see the consequences of their actions. A foul, poisonous green energy began to radiate from him. Richard noticed this and remarked that the goblin seemed like a chief. He then questioned if the goblin had planned this ambush and wondered if he wasn't afraid of falling into the hands of more powerful races. The goblin leader laughed, explaining that the closest threat was at the high mountain fortress, several miles to the east. It was a place that was easy to defend and hard to attack. Besides, he doubted the kobolds there had the courage to come out and steal his loot. Richard was surprised by this unexpected opportunity. He had been worried about not finding a suitable territory. With a sly grin, he said he felt bad that the goblin leader couldn't get his spoils, so he would give him the Dragon Slayer sword as a gift instead. Harrison immediately became alert and prepared to defend himself. But in the blink of an eye, Richard swung his sword, decapitating him. The other goblin minions were stunned and began to flee. Taking advantage of the situation, Gunther quickly ordered the capture of the remaining bandits. Richard checked the system notifications and saw that most of the barbarians had leveled up from level 3 to level 4. The nearby barbarians felt their newfound strength, believing it was due to a mysterious oriental pill. Just then, his men brought in 2 captured trolls. Seeing that the horses were dead, Richard decided the trolls would pull the supplies instead, declaring them the new marshals. As Richard studied the map, he noted that their next destination was the high mountain fortress. A large troll pulled a cart behind him, with Richard sitting on it, studying a map. He noted that this troll was quite fast, and at this pace, they would soon reach the high mountain fortress. The system panel appeared in front of him again, displaying his various stats, including weapons. Richard realized that each improvement gave him bonus points for his personal attributes. The store button was still inactive, and he needed to increase his power and throwing skills first. Weapon mastery could be enhanced through battles. but his attribute bonuses were natural, with no magical abilities involved. Being 10 times stronger than an ordinary person, he wondered if he'd keep getting stronger, imagining himself becoming a muscular giant. Just then, Gunther informed him they had arrived at the base of the high mountain fortress. Richard stood up, taking in the view of the mountain's base, the calm water, and the greenery around them. He commented that it wasn't such a bad place. Seeing the clear water in a nearby pool, a group of barbarians jumped in and began washing themselves, causing Gunther to feel a bit embarrassed. 2 barbarians approached with dead rabbits, noting the abundance of wildlife and suggesting they go on a big hunt. Richard thought they had impressive survival skills. Reason why such a good location was occupied by a weak group like the kobolds. It was likely that there were more kobold troops in the surrounding area. Russell chimed in, warning that since they had released the kobold leader earlier, he might come back with reinforcements. Richard replied that he had spent a lot of money equipping everyone with weapons and gear. This time, instead of seeking out enemies one by one, they would let them come to them. They would wait for the enemy to gather, and then take them all out at once to make more profit. After settling into the fortress, the troops celebrated. However, Gunther turned to Richard and asked why the bandits hadn't made a move despite the time that had passed. Richard, enjoying his meal, replied that she was being too impatient and suggested they wait a bit longer. The peaceful days lasted only 2 days. Richard's men soon discovered a large army stationed not far from the fortress. Wiping his mouth, Richard smiled slyly and said it was time to take action since their fortune had come to them that night. Using binoculars, Richard scanned the enemy camp and saw the goblins sleeping. Seizing this opportunity to assert control over the high mountain fortress, he decided to act. He instructed that only Gunther's squad would join him in the attack, while the rest of the barbarians and the trolls would stay behind to guard the fortress. The barbarians agreed, and Richard suggested they finish the job quickly. As the barbarians approached the sleeping goblins in their tents, Gunther opened one of the tents and swiftly killed the goblin inside with her sword. The noise woke the other goblins and a battle erupted. Watching his troops move in an organized manner, Richard quietly opened his system panel. The system had given them more than just strength. Before, they were a group of simple-minded barbarians who didn't understand the importance of coordination. Now they had become an elite force capable of forming effective battle formations. Suddenly, Russell noticed something strange as the ground began to shake violently. He was thrown aside as a massive goblin with 2 horns, the Dragon Goblin, emerged. The Dragon Goblin started chanting spells, and goblins began popping up from the ground like groundhogs. This sight frightened everyone, including Richard, who realized that the situation was becoming more challenging than expected. But that wasn't all. The goblins let out another loud roar, and a massive beast resembling a pangolin appeared, lifting the Dragon Goblin onto its back. The sight of this enormous creature terrified the barbarians again. A goblin riding the pangolin mocked them, calling them stupid losers. He then pointed his weapon at them and demanded they be punished by the power of the dragon's blood. Gunther was ready for action. She threw a spear directly at the beast. However, as soon as the spear touched the creature, it bounced off harmlessly. The goblin laughed wickedly, taunting her that her flimsy spear was no match for his beast's armor. He called her a loser and declared she would soon understand the power of dragon blood before launching an attack. As Gunther watched, the creature charged at her with incredible speed. Right in the middle of the crisis, Richard dashed in front of Gunther and grabbed the beast's leg with both hands. The beast looked down at Richard in disdain, intending to throw him off. But with a yell, Richard threw the goblin off the beast, causing the monster to crash heavily to the ground. The surrounding goblins were stunned and began screaming in fear. Russell couldn't help but wonder at Richard's strength. The dragon goblin, struggling to get up, muttered that this couldn't be happening. Richard grinned at the mention of noble dragon blood, and sarcastically suggested that the goblin's nobility might surrender. Furious, the goblin gritted his teeth, grabbed his weapon, and lunged at Richard, swearing never to give up. Richard swiftly dodged the attack and delivered a powerful punch to the goblin's face. Still defiant, Richard adjusted his cloak and walked away confidently, reminding everyone that he had finished the fight as quickly as he had promised. Meanwhile, Richard checks the characteristics window as the barbarians celebrate having a weapon with dragon blood. He noticed that his levels had increased, and he gained 175 experience points. Deciding to use these points, Richard allocated them to enhance Gunther's strength. Gunther called Richard over, showing him the pangolin they had captured and tied up. She offered it to him as a gift. Nearby, some barbarians opened large boxes that contained only 2 gold coins, revealing their dire financial situation. Richard chuckled and remarked that it seemed the goblins were also having a tough time. Gunther then asked what they should do with the monster. Richard, considering the pangolin's potential meat, patted it on the head and named it Wind Chaser. He set a clear condition. If the beast disobeyed, it would be served as food for everyone. Just then, Richard noticed the store icon was now available. He saw an old-fashioned knight spear priced at 800 dinars. Since his wallet was empty, he could only choose weapons at a discount. After making the purchase, a light shone over Richard, and the knight's spear appeared before him. Catching it, he realized he was finally starting to understand how the system worked. Gunther asked if the boss could even use special magic. At that moment, Richard sensed some movement nearby. A barbarian informed him that it looked like a group of jackals engaged in a robbery. Richard scanned the area with his binoculars and spotted a wealthy caravan, remarking that it was no wonder the jackals were attracted to it. The caravan, loaded with carts and horses, was surrounded, and its defenders were preparing for a fierce attack. Gunther asks him if they should step in. Richard points out that this isn't just any caravan, and helping them could be good for their business and help expand their territory. At the same time, the leader of the jackals demands that the people hand over all their money, claiming they're in jackal territory now. An old man from the caravan responds that they are with the Voya Trading Company, and warns that if they are harmed, the Imperial Army will come after them. The jackals just laugh at this. Their leader, smirking, says they're bandits. Do they really think mentioning the Pompel Empire will scare them? With that, he orders his men to attack the wealthy caravan. One of the caravan's defenders tries to hold off the jackals and urges the old man to run. But before he can escape, an attacker strikes the old man from behind. He falls to the ground, bleeding, pleading for mercy, saying he'll give them the money. The jackal leader scoffs, saying it's too late for mercy. No one is coming to save him. Suddenly, a spear flies through the air and pierces the leader's chest. He coughs up blood and everyone is stunned. Richard, who threw the spear, comments on how well it performs. Gunther immediately commands his barbarians to kill the jackals. The barbarians obey, charging into battle without hesitation. The jackals are caught off guard and have no idea who these attackers are. Richard, leaning casually against a tree, remarks that these jackals are just a bunch of bandits and decides he'll just watch this time as the barbarians take them down. Gunther confidently orders his men to split into two groups. Richard observes that while the barbarians are strong, as a leader, he values a disciplined army, which he believes is crucial for their future battles. All the jackals were defeated, with only two still standing. One of them decided to make a run for it, which annoyed the other. He shouted, asking if his companion was really running away. The one trying to escape replied that if he hadn't figured it out yet, Richard and the barbarians would have destroyed the alliance between the goblins, gnolls, and jackals. The other jackal then realized the truth, exclaiming that Richard, the legendary noble known as the Lord of the Wild, had appeared out of nowhere. He finally understood their dire situation, and yelled that they were doomed, and they'd better run. Both jackals sprinted away as fast as they could, but suddenly, a windmill emerged from the ground and knocked them aside. A monster then captured the two jackals. Richard was confident that his army could handle the rest of the jackals without his help. They were no longer the disorganized group they once were. A barbarian finished off the last jackal and reported back to Richard. A merchant approached Richard, thanking him for his help and calling him a warrior, promising to spread the word of his bravery. Richard, not one to be modest, replied that if they wanted to repay him, they should do so with money. The merchant was taken aback by this response. Then, a girl with long golden hair stepped out of a cart, and with a sly smile, commented that, as expected from a greedy aristocrat, Richard was indeed fascinating. A merchant girl from the Voya Trading Company steps out of the cart and introduces herself as Annie. She turns to the man behind her, calling him Rudo, and asks if he's all right. Rudo nods, saying he is fine. Annie bows and thanks Richard and the barbarians for rescuing them. Richard laughs and boasts that his soldiers are brave and that the jackals are no challenge for them. Meanwhile, the barbarians standing nearby mutter among themselves, calling Richard arrogant and complaining about how he never praises them during normal times. Annie addresses Richard as Lord and says she has a request for him. Richard asks what she needs. Annie explains that they have suffered heavy losses and that many of their people are injured or dead, making it impossible for them to complete their trade deals with the remaining caravans. She hopes they can stay with Richard and his group for a while. Richard replies without any sympathy that staying on his estate is expensive, bragging that it's known as a 5-star heart back in his homeland. Annie responds that she intends to pay with money and weapons. She then orders Rudo to bring an item. Rudo presents a turquoise ball with stars on it. Richard asks what it is, and Annie tells him to watch closely. The ball floats into the air and grows larger. Annie explains that it is a communication crystal, which she uses to send a message to their trading house for help. Richard asks when their reinforcements will arrive. She replies that it will take at least 3 days, as they are too far from Horan. The cunning Richard is still convinced that this is no ordinary caravan. He sees an opportunity to make a lot of money once their business begins. He tells them to come along, declaring that he, Richard, the Lord of the Highland Fortress, will never turn away friendly guests. Annie thanks him for his kindness. They soon arrive at the fortress. Richard observes the caravan members setting up on the street, tending to the wounded by bandaging their injuries. Annie instructs Rudo to give a healing potion to the injured soldiers. She pours a blue liquid from a vial into a large bucket. As he watches, Richard realizes that this is a legendary healing potion, one that is out of his reach due to his lower status. This potion, blessed by a high-level magician and strengthened with mid-level magic, can heal wounds instantly. Richard recalls all the details he knows about this potion, especially its high cost, and realizes, as he suspected, that this is indeed a very special caravan. As night falls, Annie asks Rudo if he has checked on all the victims. He responds that while they have no shortage of money or supplies, half of their group is either injured or dead. Annie reacts with sadness, lamenting over the loss of so many lives. Ruto reassures her, saying that they were fortunate Richard saved them. Otherwise, the situation could have been much worse. Annie turns to Ruto and asks what he thinks of Richard. Ruto replies with admiration, noting that Richard is indeed a formidable lord. When the jackals attacked, their situation seemed dire, but then Richard's soldiers appeared and completely reversed the odds. His troops fought with such strength and skill that they were clearly a cut above the rest. Annie agrees wholeheartedly, acknowledging that their survival was entirely thanks to Richard and his impressive forces. At this moment, Richard thinks about the caravan's well-equipped soldiers. Their gear appears even more impressive compared to his 4 barbarians, who are currently fighting over weapons they can't seem to share. Watching them, Richard reflects on how he managed to acquire the caravan's armor without spending a penny, and received Fred's battle axe as a reward from the system. With a smile, he concludes that his soldiers have also forces coming towards them. These centaurs are approaching the gate, led by a silver-haired girl at the front. Her name is Heather, from the Gale clan, and she holds a sword in her hand. Suddenly, spears fly toward them, landing heavily on the ground nearby. Heather notices the force behind the throws and orders her group to keep moving forward. Richard, holding a spear, is surprised that they are ignoring his warnings. He hurls another spear with all his strength, and the barbarians do the same. One of the spears flies directly at Heather, but she deflects it, slicing the spear in half with her sword. She then orders her group to stop, realizing it's too dangerous to continue at this range. Heather pulls out a white handkerchief, ties it around her sword and raises it, waving it as a sign of surrender. Gunther remarks to Richard that this centaur is clever, then turns to him and suggests that they may have surrendered. Richard says they should probably go meet them, but he orders the barrier gate to remain closed since their true intentions are still unclear. Richard approaches Heather and asks her to explain the reason for their visit. Heather bows and introduces herself as the leader of the Gale clan, saying they have come with good intentions. Richard introduces himself as the Lord of the Highland Fortress. Heather quickly asks if he is truly the invincible Richard from the martial arts competition in the southern province. Richard smiles and asks if she has heard of him. She replies that his reputation has spread far and wide, and even the Gale clan, who live in the wilderness, has heard of his feats. Richard gives a charming smile and says that his reputation is exaggerated. Heather then holds out a piece of wood and tells him they have come to share important news. Richard takes the board and asks what it says, admitting he can't make out any of the writing. Heather explained that the local people were planning to raise an army and sent her this invitation as a warning. Some of the other barbarians gather around Richard as Heather continues, explaining that the Highland Fortress once belonged to kobolds. Now that an army is forming, Gunther interrupts, pointing out that the locals have always hated their conquerors and assumes Richard knows what that means. Richard grips the board with one hand and crushes it into pieces. He states that the locals want to reclaim the Highland Fortress. Heather nods, confirming he's right, and adds that the kobolds have also enlisted the help of shamans and sorcerers, whose powers should not be underestimated. Richard starts to reply, but Heather bows and kneels, placing her hand on her chest in a gesture of respect. She openly offers her clan's help, recognizing the great challenges he will face. Richard asks why they are willing to help him, instead of those who want to take back the fortress. Heather explains that the Gale clan once belonged to the Orc Kingdom and never allied with the locals or became bandits. She then shares the story of her tribe, where everyone worked in the fields and lived a peaceful life. Her people were known for their good manners and had a rich culture of poetry and chronicles. Some were painters, while others played musical instruments. Now they hope to align themselves with a powerful lord to restore the glory days of their clan. Richard looks out the window and comments that the Gale clan really wants to join, as the system has received their request. He checks Heather's profile, noting that she is afraid of fire and skilled with both long and short bows, as well as a heavy machete. He observes that these centaurs are capable of fighting from a distance. He leads Heather and her clan to the estate and introduces Heather as the leader of the Gale clan. He admits that they have received some troubling news. Annie asks what makes the news so terrible. Richard explains that the kobolds and jackals will soon declare war on them again. Alarmed, Annie asks how soon Richard thinks this will happen. Richard considers for a moment and then estimates they have about 10 days. Hearing this, Annie and Ruto become anxious about what to do next, while Gunther and Russell are excited at the prospect of more battles. Heather reports that although the locals have formed an army, it is made up of various races. They have organized their efforts, dividing tasks and preparing food for the troops, who will need at least 10 days to arrive. Richard states that even though the enemy is formidable, they have 10 days, and that's plenty of time. He pulls out a map, spreads it on the table, and tells everyone that he has devised a strategy to defeat their foes. Gunther cheers up and eagerly asks if the boss already has a plan. He wonders if he can share it with everyone. The boss replies that they'll find out when the time is right, and for now, they shouldn't worry. Turning to Annie, the boss says that it's expensive. Supplying soldiers is costly. He makes a purchase, and a purple bow with a white feathered arrow appears out of the light. He hands it to Heather, asking her to try it out. Heather, a bit surprised, asks if he uses magic. He responds with a smile, saying it's just a little trick. She takes the bow, knocks the arrow, draws it back, and shoots at a tree, or rather, at a bee flying nearby. The bee is split in two. Richard praises her, saying her technique is excellent, and as expected, these centaurs will strengthen the Highland Fortress's long-range defense. Heather bows and thanks Sir Richard for letting her use such a heavy bow, saying it's been a long time since she last did. Richard smiles back, laughs, and says she can start training with it tomorrow. Suddenly, Rudo rushes over and says something is wrong. He kneels and reports that they found the caravan reinforcements, but it looks like they've been attacked. Richard immediately calls Heather to investigate. Annie, seeing the wounded, begins to cry, calling the attackers vile jackals. When Richard arrives, he asks Annie what happened. She explains that it looks like all the reinforcements have been wiped out. Bodies are scattered everywhere. Richard suggests sending the caravan back to Solon, saying the Highland fortress is no longer safe. One of the wounded soldiers suggests taking the healthy men and horses, arguing that even if they encounter jackals, they'll be able to fend them off. But Annie disagrees, insisting she can't abandon the wounded members of the caravan who risked their lives for her. Richard, with a greedy smile, says that in such a dangerous situation, the rent will go up, and what he sees is worth 2,000 gold. Feeling defeated, Annie tells him to do as he pleases. Meanwhile, Heather examines the spears and tells Richard that the spear smells like Chinese pine, and that's saying that there are more savages than they might think. She mentions the powerful tribes in the far north, where large groups of thousands of adult soldiers often fight for territory and forge their own weapons. Annie adds that the strength of these tribes is far greater than that of the local savages. Heather turns to her and asks if she means the caravan was attacked by ice natives. Annie confirms this, expressing concern that the arrival of the ice natives changes everything. Richard agrees, saying it's clear the ice natives have joined the war. Gunther, with ambition in his voice, suggests that they should all come at once so he can take them down in one blow. Richard nods, saying Gunther is right. They'll just capture everyone in one go. 10 days later, the centaurs rush to Richard, reporting that they've spotted the enemy. He asks where they are now. The centaur explains that the enemy has set up camp at the foot of the mountain, about 50 miles away, and it looks like they plan to attack tomorrow. Richard, pleased with this news, says they've been waiting a long time, and now the moment has finally arrived. Richard fiercely draws his sword and commands his army to prepare for battle. He tells them to cut off the enemy's heads and use them as bowls. The barbarian army moves forward with excitement, shouting with their weapons drawn as centaurs ready their bows and stomp their hooves in anticipation. As Richard straps on his armor, he feels its heavy weight. Annie turns to him, asking about his strategy and how he plans to act. He says they will first launch 2 rounds of arrows and then charge. He believes that if they can kill 100 enemies, the rest will retreat on their own. Rudo and Annie are shocked at this straightforward plan. Richard, standing confidently, assures her that everything will be fine and tells her not to worry. Meanwhile, a group of goblins marches through the mountains, led by their jackal leader riding a large jackal beast. The leader, looking at the small number of soldiers, says that if this is all the Lord has, then they're simply asking for defeat. He then turns to the kobold chief, saying they need to end this battle quickly. The kobold replies that there's no need to rush because their leader, Lord Richard, is quite formidable. Through binoculars, they see Richard standing beside Windchaser. The enemy leader notices the large number of soldiers gathered this time, and decides they must crush them. Without hesitation, the jackals and goblins launch a direct assault on the fortress. Richard, ready for battle, reflects on how life was given to them by God, but sadly, they do not cherish it. He raises his weapon high and commands everyone to prepare for war. Meanwhile, the jackal army charges forward with orders to bite their enemies to death. Heather pulls back an arrow in her bow, and the other centaurs follow her lead. When the command to fire is given, a volley of arrows is released all at once. One arrow hits a jackal, killing it instantly, but a goblin deflects another with its shield. The 2 huge armies clash, each determined to kill the other. Goblins swing swords and throw spears wildly, but Windchaser deflects their attacks with ease. The barbarians fight bravely, showing no fear in the face of the enemy. As the distance between the 2 armies closes, the ground suddenly cracks open, and a dragon goblin emerges. Richard tells Windchaser to show everyone his strength. Windchaser leaps into the air, crashing down with great force and crushing the goblins below. Richard strikes one goblin with a large fork-like weapon, and cuts down another with an axe. Russell and Gunther take turns cutting through the goblins, ordering their forces to leave no one alive. Windchaser crushes jackals with its paws. 2 goblins with weapons charge at Richard, but he pulls out his weapon, which transforms into nunchucks. He deflects their attack but falls down in the process, realizing these goblins are stronger than he expected. As 3 more goblins attack him at once, he quickly takes them all down. While he is fighting, Gunther and Russell are amazed at his strength, saying that the Lord is almost as powerful as the devil. Watching from above with binoculars, the jackal leader and the kobold chief see that their soldiers have been wiped out. The kobold panics, exclaiming how terrible the situation is, and wondering how this could happen. The jackal tells the sorcerer to cast a spell. Meanwhile, the shaman begins chanting strange and familiar spells, summoning fire from a pool of lava. The 2 leaders are pleased, confident that Richard's army will be destroyed. Richard turns around and sees the fireball, realizing it's the shaman's magic. Under the shaman's command, the fireball transforms into a fiery dragon. He warns everyone to be careful. He gets ready to block the attack and raises his weapon, but it unexpectedly breaks. He didn't anticipate the heat wave from the fire to be so strong. The fire spreads everywhere, causing the barbarians to feel afraid as the shaman's spells are very powerful. One of the barbarians says it's the first time he's been injured. Richard states that they need to figure out how to deal with the shaman since it seems like she controls the fire with a wand. Heather approaches Richard and asks if he's okay. He tells her she arrived just in time and points to the shaman, asking if she can shoot from such a long distance. Heather replies that she can do it easily. Heather gives the command, and the centaurs pull arrows onto their bows. As soon as Heather says fire, everyone releases their arrows. She orders them to keep shooting, and they obey. A large number of arrows fly toward the enemy. The jackal calls it a rain of arrows, and tells the goblins to protect the shaman by the fire. Goblins with shields rush to guard the shaman. Richard swings and throws his spear while ordering a surprise attack. The jackal believes everything will be fine if they protect the shaman, but mid-sentence, the spear hits him directly. The force of the spear knocks him back, taking down the goblins guarding the shaman. The shaman's wand breaks, and the fireball falls onto their own army of goblins and jackals. Goblins are burned by the fire and collapse to the ground. Richard notices the fire spreading around them. The kobold observer tries to help Chief Jackal but quickly realizes that he's already dead. He turns to the shaman and asks what they should do next. The shaman stirs something in a bowl, and without the wand, a purple flame-like energy appears. Thinking the battle is over, Richard says it's time to clean up, but suddenly, he sees the goblins who were previously dead, rising up from the ground. They've been possessed by the shaman's magic, which Richard realizes is making them bloodthirsty. The goblins and jackals stand up suddenly and attack without using weapons. Richard swings his sword at a jackal, slicing its body into pieces. He kills 3 attacking goblins in the same way, and continues moving forward. Gunther is also fighting. He reaches the shaman and says that he has finally caught them. The kobold admits defeat, and the shaman sits on the kobold's shoulders, trying to escape. He asks if they really think they can run away. He takes off his helmet and throws it at them, knocking the shaman off the kobold's back. He approaches the shaman and menacingly says that he has caught him. The shaman turns his head, revealing that it's actually a witch. He laughs, saying he didn't expect the shaman to be a woman. While holding the shaman by the tail, he asks Gunther what happened to Nate, one of his barbarians. She replies that Nate has a serious wound and needs medical help. Richard throws the shaman to the ground, saying that she's killed many people, and orders her to save Nate. The shaman looks away and explains that she was forced to attack Richard's army, asking not to be called Hey, but by her name, Modir. With a threatening expression, he asks if she dares to argue and warns that he will make her suffer in every way possible. The shaman immediately panics, raising her hands in surrender, and agrees to help. She casts a spell near Nate, who suddenly wakes up, groaning and moving his hand. Everyone watches closely, their faces filled with surprise and anticipation. The shaman, leaning back, looks exhausted and says she is tired. The barbarians surround Nate, amazed that he is fully healed, and his wounds have disappeared as if they never existed. Richard realizes that Modir is powerful in both destruction and healing. He decides that she could be a valuable asset at the Highland Fortress. Gunther then asks him what they should do with the jackals and goblins. He responds that they need to clean up the battlefield and make all the survivors submit to him. One barbarian notes that they have caught a lot this time. He looks out the system window at the many requests and is pleased to see several upgrades. Russell, the hero, is upgraded to a first-class warrior with an axe and gains 2 character points. Gunther, distracted by his question, asks what they'll do with the witch Modir lying quietly on the ground. Richard picks up the kobold by the leg and orders him to take the witch with him and find their base. Richard splits Heather's leveling points between strength and speed, deciding this will work. Heather informs him that they couldn't get any information from the magician. He asks if they tried torturing her. She replies that they used all sorts of threats and torture, but she didn't say anything. He confidently says catching a phoenix is not as easy as catching a chicken and offers to show them how it's done. He stands up and walks toward them. The kobold is tied up by its legs and arms, hanging against the wall. The shaman tries to rebel, threatening to turn them all into insects if they hit her again. Richard and Heather enter the room. The shaman immediately sits down, calling him Pompeian, and asks him to control his subordinates, who don't respect her. Richard smiles, calls her Hey, again, and demands to know the location of her base. The witch, annoyed, yells that she's already told them she won't say anything and that she has the blood of a dragon. In the middle of her speech, Richard punches her in the face, sending her flying. Heather is shocked by his sudden action. He lifts the shaman up and asks again where her base is. She quickly responds that it's in the mountains, 200 miles away. He then asks how many warriors are left in their tribe. She immediately says there are none left, as they've all been defeated. He warns her menacingly that if she's lying, he'll break her teeth. She panics and insists she's telling the truth, explaining that all the soldiers went to war and only old women and children are left. He then asks how many spells she knows. With wide eyes, almost in tears, she explains that there are many different shamans in the wild, and that, having the blood of a red dragon, she has mastered fire magic completely. She adds that the Minotaur shamans can control the element of earth, create avalanches, and destroy the ground, while the troll shamans control trees and plants, killing all living things. He thinks about this and remarks that the wilderness is much more dangerous than he expected. He calls Heather and tells her to find Gunther and come up with an attack plan. The barbarian asks what they should do with the kobold and the witch. He says they are useless and orders them to be buried behind the mountain. Shaman quickly protests, insisting she is still useful and can help them. He asks how she could possibly be of help. She replies that when she came to the Highland Fortress, she saw two giant monsters who had the unique talents of a shaman. She claims that as a shaman herself, she can train them, turning them into powerful and unpredictable Shura shamans with an endless supply of mana. 2 days later, Richard plans to demolish the Highland Fortress. The slaves he brought back have been working tirelessly to rebuild it. When Heather asks about his plans, Richard explains that after the demolition, they will begin constructing defensive structures around the fortress. Then, they will use granite to reinforce the foundation, making the entire structure much stronger. This time, Richard is determined to make the fortress the most formidable and unbreakable castle in the wilderness. He gives Heather a new mission, to lead a small team to scout out the enemy base the shaman had mentioned and confirm if her claims are true. When she asks if he wants her to eliminate the enemy forces, he makes it clear she only needs to gather information. The village is mostly populated by elderly women, the weak, and children, so she and the centaurs will need to be quick and efficient. Heather agrees, mentioning that 2 days ago, she felt the wind beneath her feet as if it was urging her forward. She assures him she would lead the team and return promptly with the report. He cautioned her to stay vigilant and ensure her team's safe return. After sending Heather on her mission, he heads to the back mountain to check on the trolls' training progress. Seeing they aren't tapping into their magical potential, he questions whether their training had gone deep enough. So far, there hasn't been any noticeable improvement. The shaman feels Richard seem unaware of her true power, so she decides to cast a spell. The magic immediately alerts the trolls, causing them to instinctively awaken a counter skill. She informed Richard that one of the trolls had activated the stone skin art skill. She adds that to avoid being hit, the troll had also developed the ability to turn invisible. The awakening of shamans focuses on the harmony between time, place, and relationships, which explains why the other troll hadn't awakened any special skills yet. Richard considers the ability to turn invisible might seem a bit underwhelming, but at least it is still a magical skill. Just then, Annie called out to Richard from behind. He asked if they had returned safely to Corin City. She replied that they were planning to transport some goods for trade with the Darwinian tribe and happened to cross paths with him. Richard approached the cart and inspected its contents, which were packed with coal. He asked why there was such a great trade in coal. Annie explained that they used the coal to trade with the dwarves for gold coins and fur. Aware of this, Richard asked why the dwarves needed so much coal. She explained that last year the dwarves had discovered an iron ore vein in Lake Bayou, 150 miles west of High Mountain Fortress, which was why they had been purchasing large quantities of coal. At that moment, Richard suddenly received a letter from the Lord of Corin City, ordering all nobles expanding their territories outside to return to the city. Almost immediately, Heather came running towards him, looking distressed. Richard was surprised by her early return from the shaman tribes 400 miles away, and feared she might have been injured or attacked along the way. Heather reported that there was no immediate threat in the Jackal and Shaman's tribe, though they did come across some injured soldiers. However, on their way back, they passed through a dwarf village and found piles of dwarf corpses scattered across the ground. As they wondered who could have committed such a brutal attack, a huge black figure appeared before them. Without hesitation, Richard identified the attackers as bearmen. Heather was surprised and asked how Richard knew. Richard explained that he had learned from the letter sent by the Lord of Corin City, which warned everyone to return to the city because a large wave of bearmen had been spotted moving south, putting many nobles in danger. But Richard, a proud warrior, had no intention of fleeing like a coward. Instead, he ordered Gunther and the others to rest and prepare for what was to come. Richard then turned to Annie and remarked that her business with the dwarves seemed unfinished. He suggested she hand over the coal instead. Annie was confused by his request, but Richard quickly clarified. He needed the coal because he had built a factory and was crafting his own weapons for the fortress. He emphasized that they needed a steady supply of weapons to face the unknown enemies they might encounter. Richard then asked Gunther about the weapon he had commissioned. Gunther confirmed they had built it according to Richard's specifications. Richard moved to unveil it, revealing a massive flaming cannon before their eyes. He explained that such a weapon existed only in his true homeland, leaving Annie and the shaman stunned by the sight of the advanced technology. As night fell, Richard and his group arrived at the dwarf village. The ground was littered with corpses and marked with the footprints of bearmen. Heather shuddered, recalling how the bearmen had come in large numbers, and they had only survived by fleeing as fast as they could. Richard reflected that if he hadn't upgraded the speed attribute of his centaur tribe, they might not have made it out alive. Richard instructed his men to search the area for anything useful, but they came back empty-handed. Annie, standing to the side, calmly remarked that bearmen were a violent and greedy race that wouldn't leave anything of value behind. Richard, however, disagreed, believing that value could mean different things to different people. He suddenly spotted a jar filled with a dark liquid inside a tent. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was a jar of soy sauce. It seemed the bearmen hadn't realized the worth of soy sauce. Annie, intrigued, asked what was so delightful about it. Richard replied that if they took the soy sauce back to Corin City, they could open a restaurant and make a fortune. His entrepreneurial spirit even impressed Annie, a seasoned merchant. Later, Richard decided they would camp at the site overnight. Ruto asked his father why they were staying when they had only come to scout out the enemy. He insisted they should leave only after seeing the bearmen themselves. During the expedition, Annie appeared worried. She suspected that the bearmen and the dwarves were locked in a conflict and thought it best to avoid getting involved. However, she struggled to understand why Richard was engaging in this war. Richard explained that since she seemed to grasp the situation, she must also understand why the bearmen had started this war. Sue quickly realized that the two tribes were likely fighting over control of the iron mine. In a time when primitive weapons ruled, whoever controlled the resources had the advantage. If the bearmen and the dwarves could compete for it, why couldn't they seize it themselves? Annie still tried to persuade Richard, arguing that a large-scale war like this might be too much for the high mountain fortress army to handle. Richard replied confidently, questioning why she had followed them if she believed it was too dangerous. He reminded her that the strength of the high mountain fortress was far greater than it had been in the past. Just then, Gunther and Russell arrived with 3 cannons and a magical group of 3 wizards. Richard pointed out that they also had brave and skilled barbarian warriors and an archery unit. He continued to persuade Annie, stating that with her support, they could win this war. He believed that if he could win her over, he could establish connections with the dwarves. So, he proposed a deal. He would give her half of the iron ore if she agreed to cooperate. Annie accepted the offer. With his entire army lined up, Richard drew his dragon's lair sword and stood atop a high tower. He shouted that this battle was not only for the high mountain fortress, but also for themselves. They must become the unyielding force that could crush their enemies. His words ignited a fierce determination in the soldiers below, who were now fired up and ready for battle. Under the cover of night, Richard led his army to the dwarves' castle. He had planned to strike first, but a group of rabbit folk got there ahead of him. He quickly ordered his men to hide. Watching the rabbits raiding the castle, he wondered why rabbit folk were involved in a battle between the bearmen and the dwarves. Annie explained that these rabbits were vassals of the bearmen. Gunther told him that powerful races often recruit weaker ones as vassals, forcing them to do menial tasks. Richard, surprised by this revelation, asked why they hadn't told him sooner. They replied that they didn't expect a lord like him to be unaware. Feeling embarrassed, he noticed the little shaman nearby and playfully tapped her head, telling her to bow. By then, the rabbits had already climbed over the wall, unnoticed by the dwarven guards. The rabbits quickly gained the upper hand and launched a final assault. The guards shouted that enemies were approaching from Bayou Lake. Hearing this, all the wall's defenses were alerted. Believing the bearmen had started their attack, the battle began, with the dwarves shooting arrows at the rabbits. The rabbits defended themselves with shields as they rushed toward the gate, crossing the lake. Less strategic dwarves opened the gate to seize the rabbit attackers. Seeing this chance, the rabbit chief ordered a full-on assault. Suddenly, a cannon blast sent a large group of rabbits flying. To the chief's surprise, Richard stood in the distance with a smug look, ready to take his turn in the battle. The enraged rabbit chief, thinking reinforcements had arrived for the dwarves, turned the attack toward Richard and charged at him. But he was ready for the attack, and the rabbits were no match for his barbarian army. He slashed through the rabbits as if they were mere vegetables, while his troops fought with fierce determination. The rabbit clan quickly lost their strength and couldn't resist. Gunther chanted that their strength lay only in numbers and could be crushed with a single blow. Suddenly, Richard felt the ground shake and turned around. At first, he thought it was an earthquake, but then he saw a massive shadow looming behind him. The giant was many times larger and more powerful than anything he had seen, leaving him in awe of its sudden presence. The bearmen roared and swung their flail with one powerful arm. The blow struck Richard with a bone-crushing force, and he could do little to defend himself. The impact sent him flying far back. Seizing the moment, the bearmen leader ordered his army to attack. Although the bearmen didn't have an advantage in number, his troops were formidable. The well-trained centaur units acted as rear guards, countering the bearmen with deadly arrows that struck with precision. Meanwhile, 3 armored rabbits stood ready, with the one in the center wielding a spear and directing the reserve forces to advance. The castle loomed large as a swarm of small figures approached, and 2 voices repeatedly shouted to kill them all. The shaman began casting a spell, hurling a series of fireballs at the bearmen. At the same time, one of the trolls, trained by the shaman, activated a stone skill that shattered the bearmen's swords, then used fire to drive them back. On the city wall, the dwarf tribe was momentarily confused. The chief dwarf, Lobby, couldn't identify who their unexpected ally was on the battlefield. His commander, Sendak, urged him to allow their forces to join the fight against the bearmen, but Lobby refused. Instead, he ordered Sendak to assist the injured soldiers, leaving the battle to Richard's army below. A mob of 3 giant bearmen charges toward Richard's army. Determined to show them his power, he activates his system, unleashing a massive, swirling energy that strikes beasts, leaving him stunned. The force of the tornado sweeps away the surrounding rabbit folk. Now Richard and the beast stand face to face, ready for combat. He strikes at one of them with his sword, but the beast quickly blocks it with metal chains. Recognizing the beast's immense strength, he swiftly activates the skill Vault of Heaven, and with lightning speed, slices it in half with a single devastating blow. This battle was a piece of cake for him, thanks to his unbeatable system. On the other side, Gunther charged at a bearman, shouting a challenge as she prepared to strike. The clash was fierce, with the bearman swinging its massive sword. Gunther barely managed to block the attack, but the bearman landed a powerful blow, sending her flying and crashing into the ground. Seeing this, Russell couldn't hold back and hurled his double-bladed axe at the bearman. However, his weapon didn't leave a scratch. Suddenly, a flash of light sliced through the air, instantly decapitating the bearman. It was Richard, using the troll's invincible artifact to launch an assault. Everyone rushed to check on Gunther's condition. Despite suffering a potentially deadly blow, she was unharmed, protected by the troll's stone skin and invisibility spells. These spells could be cast not only on the trolls but also on teammates over a wide area. As Gunther and her group celebrated what they thought was a total victory, red smoke suddenly flooded the battlefield. To their horror, the fallen bearmen and rabbit folk began to rise within the smoke. The shaman, with her vast experience and knowledge, quickly recognized the spell as the madness art. She realized only the minotaurs of the waning moon tribe could cast such magic, and feared that this tribe might not be far away. She explained to Richard that in the southwest of the Pompeii Empire lived the Torrent Orcs tribe, a group of fierce and aggressive minotaurs. Known for their wild nature and mastery of the shaman's preserved spells, they were almost unbeatable in battle, earning them the name Bloodhoof Tribe. Back on the battlefield, the resurrected bearmen and rabbit folk charged at Richard's forces once again. Richard began scanning the area for the one who had cast the spell. The shaman informed him that the enemies were only in a state of partial berserk, which meant the caster was not present on the scene. Hearing this, he felt relieved. This group of revived soldiers stood no chance against Gunther and his team, who cut them down with ease. The troops chanted in victory as Richard turned his attention to aiding the dwarves by driving away the bearmen, hoping to earn a share of the iron ore in return. He approached the front of the dwarf castle, where the dwarves eyed him warily and asked his purpose. He introduced himself as Baron Richard, Lord of the High Mountains Fortress of the Pompeii Empire. However, when Lobby spotted Annie with him, he immediately ordered the gates to be opened and warmly welcomed her, much to Richard's irritation, as he was referred to as Annie's sidekick. Richard, feeling slighted, considered calling Lobby Shabby instead of by his name. Annie explained that Lord Richard had come to help. Lobby replied by thanking God for their protection and enabling them to survive the attack, which annoyed Richard further. He felt the dwarves should be thanking him, not God. Once inside the castle, Lobby confessed he never expected them to arrive in time. Annie told him that she and Lord Richard had learned of the Bearman's invasion plan, prompting them to rush to the dwarves' aid, knowing they couldn't hold back the attack alone. Overwhelmed, Lobby tearfully admitted that without their help, his forces would have been completely wiped out. Upon seeing his reaction, Richard couldn't help but chuckle. Lobby, thinking he was mocking him, glared at him in anger. Richard tried to awkwardly deny that he had laughed, but the tension was clear. Then Annie stepped in, saying that Richard was a famous warrior in Pompeii, a man who had come to help Dwarf Fortress out of genuine concern. Hearing this, Lobby guessed his duchy and cultivation might be pretty profound. Dochi in general display the powerful abilities of martial warriors, skills that Richard had never practiced in his life. Skeptical, Lobby questioned how he could have gained such fame as a warrior. With a sly smile, he replied that his peers had helped him in battle. Annie, sensing the growing tension, whispered quietly to Richard, "That's enough, Lord Richard." She then asked Lobby about his plan to face any future attacks from the Bearmen, noting how they had barely survived the current conflict. Lobby, clearly exhausted, said he just wanted a night's rest and would strategize the next day. Richard requested accommodation for his troops, and Lobby said that the tribe's stone houses were available for them. As they walked away, Annie continued to advise him not to take Lobby's blunt replies to heart, but he harbored deep disdain for Lobby. In his eyes, an emotional and tearful leader like Lobby stood no chance of winning this battle. Annie responded that not everyone was fearless in war, to which he replied that while everyone fears war and death, victory comes to those who make their enemies fear them even more. With that, they headed to rest. Elsewhere, two armored figures lay on the ground. One, injured, reassured the other that they'd feel better once they were outside. The other, annoyed, stood up and warned them to be quiet, not wanting to alert the barbarians and trolls nearby. Upon reaching their resting room, Richard was able to lie down and nap, but Heather had to kneel on the ground to rest. The room the dwarves had prepared was simply too low for someone of Heather's height. Suddenly, the house shook violently. Richard, instantly alert, sat up in bed and went to the window to investigate. The intensity of the tremors made him suspect a looming threat. It quickly became clear. The Minotaurs had returned, this time bringing the Bearmen with them for revenge. Meanwhile, on the city walls, a group of dwarves quickly sprang into action, grabbing their horns and sounding the alarm. Before long, a large army had assembled in front of the sea gate. As Richard and his group stood before the dwarves, he could sense the lingering resentment in the dwarven army. After all, he had mocked them earlier while they were in the castle. But Lobby responded boldly, reminding them that the waning moon tribe and the Minotaurs were coming at full force. He told them they were about to risk their lives for their tribe. His commander, Sendak, also shared a plan to divide the impulsive orcs before launching an attack. He pointed out that, due to their short stature, their enemies would have to stoop down to attack them, giving the dwarves a natural advantage in battle. The proud dwarven army, however, refused to let Richard and his group take the lead. Determined and confident, they marched forward to confront the enemy themselves. Seeing the stubborn pride in the dwarves, Richard could only smile and let them have their way. Gunther joked with Heather about her height, playfully warning her that it was dangerous because she might get hit by the orcs. Heather shot back, reminding him that she wasn't that short. Suddenly, heavy rain began to fall. The soldiers were growing fearful that the fierce minotaurs might breach the city. Overhearing their concerns, Sendak dismissed their worries and urged them to focus on their duties. As they watched the minotaurs and bearmen charging toward them, Richard wished he could capture some alive to sell to the Colosseum. Gunther cheerfully agreed, noting it would bring in a substantial profit. Amid the chaos, the dwarfs, drenched in sweat and terrified, marveled at the calm demeanor of the high mountain fortress people, thinking they must be insane. Standing on the fortress wall, Lobby asked Richard if the cannon they had used earlier was still functional. Richard reluctantly admitted that they had already run out of cannonballs. Lobby then turned to Sendak and inquired about their supply of crossbow bolts. Sendak informed him they had only 6 left. With no other choice, Lobby decided they would have to use the remaining crossbows very carefully against the approaching minotaurs. However, the dwarves' plan was too simple. After just one charge, the enemy easily defeated and scattered them. Realizing it was time to unleash their key weapon, the dwarves waited until the enemy was within range of them and then fired all the crossbows at once. One bolt struck a minotaur in the eye, taking him down, but the others failed to cause significant damage. Soon, the enemy reached the city gates. Watching his army being slaughtered, Lobby began to sweat in fear, realizing they were now doomed. Gunther asked Richard what their next move was. He replied that the minotaurs had gone mad, making them difficult to handle. His face became serious. He glanced at Gunther and asked why he hadn't seen his magic team after so long. She informed him that the shaman had tried to escape after sensing the danger, but had already been caught. He grabbed the shaman by the arm and exclaimed in anger, questioning how she could attempt to flee at such a crucial moment. He called her a disgrace and reminded her that even if the enemy possessed the madness art, she still had bloodthirsty magic. When Lobby heard the words, bloodthirsty magic, it was as if he had found a lifeline, and he urged her to use it immediately. But Richard ignored him, and instead ordered the shaman to cast the bloodthirsty magic on the rampaging minotaurs. This command shocked everyone, and Lobby was certain he had lost his mind. Richard, however, simply gave a mysterious look and told Lobby to stop talking nonsense and follow his orders. The shaman, left with no choice, complied. She infused the already frenzied minotaurs with bloodthirsty magic. When she saw the effect, the shaman was convinced that Richard had completely lost his mind. The shaman struck a pose, and an aura enveloped her completely. As Richard urged her to cast the magic quickly, the aura began to materialize above the minotaurs, then encircled them. The minotaurs started to feel an overwhelming energy surging through them. Seeing the minotaurs suddenly stop, the nearby dwarf soldiers seized the opportunity to escape. But now, the minotaurs had gone berserk, and fear gripped everyone at the sight of the raging beasts. The shaman tried to flee, but Richard caught her and demanded that she open her eyes and observe closely. The minotaurs, now infused with bloodthirsty magic, appeared even more aggressive. He explained that the larger the creature, the greater the strain on its heart. He had deliberately combined the spells, knowing it would push the minotaurs' hearts beyond their limits. As the burden on their hearts became too great, the minotaurs began to collapse. Everyone was stunned by the outcome, but Richard calmly gained 600 experience points and coins for killing 3 giant minotaurs. The others, still bewildered, asked him what he had done. He explained that everything follows its own rules. The minotaurs were powerful warriors but had their limits. Their strength came from their madness, which put immense strain on their hearts. The bloodthirsty magic was the final blow that pushed them over the edge. Lobby, finally understanding, excitedly realized that the magic caused the minotaurs' internal energy to pile up until it exceeded the limits of their bodies, triggering a deadly condition. In short, Richard had used the minotaurs' own powerful bodies against them. Richard had already identified the flaw in both the madness art and bloodthirsty magic. Lobby praised his clever move, but the shaman tried to take the credit, proclaiming that she had done all the work. Richard, however, quickly reminded her of the punishment for desertion, viewing her as a seasoned shaman who should know better. He continued to scold her with harsh words, accusing her of fleeing just because they faced a strong enemy and now trying to claim victory. He added that while his fortress would rise to greatness, her experience and commitment remained low, just like her courage. These words brought the young girl to tears. Despite the tense exchange, they approached the minotaurs to check if they were truly dead. Although it was clear that the visceral hemorrhage had killed them, Richard felt a pang of regret. He had hoped to sell one to the Colosseum. Though the Bloodhoof tribe's attack had been temporarily halted, Richard sensed that a more dangerous storm might be brewing, and the dwarven stronghold could become even more perilous. Noticing a crossbow bolt embedded in one of the minotaurs, he asked Lobby if all their weapons were forged from the iron ore in Bayou Lake. Surprised, Lobby confirmed that they were. With the system at his disposal, Richard felt no fear. He knew that as the war dragged on, he would get what he needed. For now, he planned to focus on helping the dwarves. He kindly suggested that Lobby should start making more crossbows and bolts, as they would be crucial in the future. However, Lobby looked troubled. He explained that while making arrows was easy, preparing the bed crossbows was much more challenging. Sendak then invited Richard to come with him and see the problem they were facing firsthand. Upon arriving at the castle, Richard found it amusingly short, to which the Lord remarked that he never expected to accommodate humans. Lobby then showed him the crossbow beds. They had built many, and they were incredibly powerful with long ranges. Richard suggested attaching binoculars to improve their aim. Lobby explained that the real problem was the lack of strings. Since the crossbow beds were made entirely of steel, ordinary sheep tendons couldn't withstand the tension. They had discovered that dried and dehydrated giant Monica leech tendons could work, but those were rare and couldn't be bought with money. Hearing this, Richard had an idea and eagerly asked if he had some gold coins. Lobby, puzzled, asked if he was planning to sell Monica leeches. Richard, with a hint of apology, admitted that he didn't. Lobby silently cursed him, thinking Richard talked a big game but didn't have what was needed. Seriously, what a letdown. Richard then told him that the centaurs use Komodo dragon tendons to make bowstrings. While he couldn't buy giant leeches, he could purchase other substitutes from the system mall. Excited by the idea, he agreed it was a great plan. Richard mentioned that he would need some gold coins to make the purchase. Lobby assured him that, thanks to their trade, gold wasn't an issue for the dwarves. Even more thrilled, Richard urged him to quickly bring more gold. The soldiers quickly brought the gold, and one of them asked Commander Sendak why they needed such a large pile of coins. Sendak explained that Lord Richard would use it to get them crossbow strings. The soldiers speculated that Richard might have other motives besides helping them. Another soldier agreed, suggesting they should be cautious around him. However, Sendak objected, reminding them that Richard had previously saved them, and without his help, they would have nothing. Now, the Komodo dragon tendons were being fixed onto the crossbows. Lobby informed him that while the new bowstrings were more durable, they wouldn't last long if they faced a large number of enemies again. He asked if Lobby was afraid of losing the war. Tearfully, Lobby admitted that after half a month of fighting, many of their men were injured or dead, and they couldn't bear more losses. Seeing Lobby so fearful, he revealed that the true cause of the war was the iron ore. He suggested that they withdraw from Lake Bayou for now. Since the enemy was after the iron ore, they could wait until the enemy fought amongst themselves and weakened before taking back Lake Bayou. After hearing his suggestion, Lobby quickly waved his hands in refusal. He explained that Lake Bayou held more than just iron ore. There was also a secret that couldn't be revealed. Richard began to suspect that the dwarves might be hiding something else beneath Lake Bayou. At this time, in the council hall, the dwarves debated whether to reveal the secret at the bottom of the lake to Richard. Sendak pointed out that what was important to them might not hold the same value in Richard's eyes. Although they knew Richard was there for the iron ore, he hadn't resorted to forceful measures like their enemies. Moreover, their strength was now insufficient to resist the coming enemy forces. Instead of guarding a secret and risking annihilation, it might be wiser to find an ally for protection. After further discussion, Lobby decided to show Richard the secret himself. Meanwhile, two trolls had awakened a new magic, the flowering art. Richard, irritated, directed his anger at the shaman. She defended herself, reminding him that he always dismissed her teachings, just like the stone skin art. Annie advised him to be patient, explaining that magic arts often awaken randomly. He, softening, patted the shaman's head, encouraging her to work harder so that his sorcerer team could cast more powerful spells. Later, Richard went with Sendak to Lake Bayou. Donning diving helmets, they descended to the lake's bottom, where he was stunned to see thick iron chains wrapped around an ancient, enormous figure, a titan giant. He realized that the dwarves had been using the iron ore mine as a cover to protect this hidden secret. The group swam cautiously toward the giant, whose massive eyes began to glow with a red light, sensing their presence. When they surfaced, he removed his helmet and expressed his shock at discovering an ancient giant hidden beneath the water. Lobby explained that they had stumbled upon the titan while mining iron ore. Richard then asked what had driven them to risk their lives to protect this giant. With a chuckle, Lobby revealed that this titan was no ordinary giant. It was the ancestor of the dwarf race. Richard's mouth twitched in disbelief. What kind of giant could possibly be the progenitor of the dwarves? Seeing his skepticism, Lobby jumped back into the water. As the titan's eyes glowed once again, Lobby explained that the giant's soul could sense the dwarves' blood and emit light. He concluded that the titan was their god. Richard noticed that the red light emanated from the titan's body, just as Lobby had claimed, providing the proof of their connection. As an ancient magical species, the titans were far larger than even the giant dragons. In a time of chaos, their presence embodied power. There was no doubt that the titan, wielding creation magic, was the true ruler of the land, erasing all threats in their path. Yet, no creature can escape the cycle of life and death, and history began to shift. Survival became increasingly difficult for the titans, their numbers dwindling until eventually they vanished from the earth. Richard wondered why, after discovering the titan giant, they didn't simply break through the mountain and take the giant away. Lobby, frustrated, explained that it wasn't that they didn't want to, it was that they couldn't. The iron ore emitted a unique magnetic field that trapped the titan's soul within its eyeballs. Initially, the titan's red light was strong, but as they continued mining, it dimmed significantly. They had even issued a ban on further mining. Although Richard understood their intentions, he questioned whether they intended to guard the titan until their deaths. Lobby revealed that after years of study, they had identified certain patterns. They found that on the night of a full moon, the titan's power could be fully activated. According to their clan's ancient texts, this soul power could be passed down. They had been attempting to cast spells on full moon nights to inherit the Titan's power. In despair, Lobby admitted that despite many attempts, they had never succeeded. One of the commanders informed Lobby that they had calculated that tomorrow would bring the fullest moment of the moon. This, they believed, would be their best chance to cast spells and inherit the Titan's power. Richard finally understood why this group of dwarves was so determined to guard Lake Bayou, even at the cost of their lives. He asked them why they were sharing this information with him. Weren't they afraid that he might become interested in the spirit power? Lobby explained that this spirit power was the Titan's final legacy. They feared more that no one would inherit this power, and that it would remain sealed away, never to see daylight, rather than it falling into someone else's hands. The senior commander, though hesitant, replied that they had discussed the matter. If the dwarves failed to inherit the power, perhaps Richard could try. Showing little interest, he responded that if the dwarves had failed countless times, what chance did a human like him have? Wasn't he just setting himself up for failure? The senior commander insisted that he might succeed because he was stronger than most. Richard explained that the spirit and body are closely connected, making it more likely for dwarves related by blood to succeed in something like this. Lobby agreed, laughing, and acknowledged that Richard had a valid point. Richard then suggested they head back, as staying too long could raise suspicions. On the way back, Lobby asked him to keep everything a secret, especially from Miss Annie. Richard agreed and returned to the tribe's stone house. Later, as Richard soaked, Gunther questioned his boss's sudden and suspicious absence. Richard quickly fabricated a story, saying he accidentally fell into the lake. To change the subject, he asked where everyone else was. Gunther informed him that Miss Annie had gone to see the shaman training the trolls, and Heather and the others were on sentry duty. Richard sighed, hoping the dwarves could inherit the Titan's spirit power. Just as he was thinking this, Heather came running toward him in a state of urgency. She informed him that the enemy was approaching, only 70 miles away from the tribe. Attacking at this time was unfavorable for the dwarves. He asked about the enemy's numbers, and Heather reported that their army exceeded 5,000 soldiers. Richard smirked. It seemed there would be another big battle tomorrow night, under the full moon. Despite the thunderstorm, the dwarf army quickly set up defensive fortifications. With their shields up, the fully armed soldiers gathered together, forming an impenetrable wall against the enemy. Through his binoculars, the chief of the Bearmen sneered at the sight of the armed dwarves, calling them hopeless. He ordered his forces to capture the dwarf fortress before sunset. The massive army of Bearmen began their march toward the fortress. At this moment, Lobby was terrified. He lamented that if only they had 2 more days, they wouldn't have to fight this battle. They could inherit the Titan's spirit power. Seeing Lobby's despair, Richard urged him to stay strong, reminding him that the fortress was counting on him. Just then, the Orc Alliance launched a full-scale attack. Seeing this, Richard quickly ordered the archers on the city walls and below to release a wave of arrows. While the dense volley managed to kill many orcs, it couldn't stop the relentless advance of the Bearmen and trolls. The shaman stood atop the city wall, continuously casting fireball spells. The entire battlefield became a chaotic mix of smoke and fire. Both sides fought fiercely, using all their skills to take down their enemies. However, with their superior numbers and size, the Bearmen and Minotaurs soon began to dominate the battlefield. Richard saw the situation and immediately drew his sword, charging into the battlefield. He swiftly severed a Bearman's arm, saving a teammate in the process. But this act also caught the attention of the Bear King. The Bear King grabbed a meteor hammer and swung it at Richard. Richard blocked with his sword, but the force behind the blow was overwhelming. The impact injured him, which only fueled the morale of the Bearman soldiers. Richard, eyes blazing with determination, gritted his teeth and charged back into the fight. The battle raged on from dawn until dusk. The battlefield was littered with corpses, yet neither side was willing to surrender. Gunther informed Richard that the enemy's numbers were overwhelming, and that even though they had killed many, it seemed endless. He glanced at the system panel, concern etched on his face. This was the first time his forces had suffered such heavy losses. Watching the enemy forces continue to flood the battlefield, he coldly gave the order to retreat. The situation had become too dire to push forward. Their only hope now was to hold the castle and wear down the enemy until a chance for victory emerged. Back at the castle, the scene was grim, with countless soldiers dead or injured. Among them was Sendak, who had also fallen in battle. When Richard arrived and saw Lobby crouched in a corner, crying bitterly, he was furious. Grabbing Lobby by the beard, he demanded that he take responsibility as a chief and rally his soldiers to fight the Waning Moon tribe. Reluctantly, Lobby complied. Meanwhile, Sendak's death left Annie worried, so she asked him about the state of the war. Already enraged, he snapped, pointing out that the Waning Moon tribe had forced them to retreat, and now the Bearmen were on the verge of breaking through the fortress gate. Though the trolls' stoneskin art had reinforced the gate, the enemy's numbers were overwhelming, and they had started climbing the walls. To make matters worse, the orcs had also joined the Waning Moon in their attack. Seeing the trolls and shamans standing by as the orcs scaled the walls, Richard furiously demanded an explanation. The shaman explained that the heavy rain had rendered the wizard's fireball spells ineffective. The city gate was finally breached, leaving a gaping hole. The Minotaurs and Bearmen were eager to storm in. Gunther informed Richard that the stoneskin art could hold off the Minotaurs for now, but they needed to come up with a plan quickly. Richard turned to Lobby and asked how many soldiers they had left. Lobby replied helplessly that only about 100 remained. Seeing the approaching Minotaurs, Richard grinned with a bloodthirsty determination. If they were going to win this battle, each warrior would need to fight as if against 10 enemies. Under Richard's command, the barbarians, dwarves, and centaurs charged together, aiming to break the enemy's formation. Richard, fueled by adrenaline, swiftly cut down a large number of enemies. The Bear King then ordered his elite forces to target Richard. His sword hummed with power as he spun it, summoning a whirlwind of blue energy. He unleashed the storm, sending a massive wave of energy crashing through his foes. Gunther couldn't help but marvel at his boss's prowess, though Richard had no time for flattery. Despite his efforts, the enemies were outmatched. The Bearmen continued their merciless assault, and Gunther realized that if things continued like this, they would be wiped out. Seeing the dire situation, Richard turned and shouted for the shaman to cast bloodthirst on the dwarves, giving them the strength to keep fighting. The shaman took a strange stance as he finished casting a brief spell. Golden light poured down from the sky onto the soldiers. Richard quickly ordered his sorcery team to channel as much magic as possible to him. At the same time, the troll cast stone skin on the dwarves. The dwarves' eyes turned red, and their strength surged. When a rabbit folk struck a dwarf with a sword, the sword shattered, and the dwarf ruthlessly crushed the attacker before they could react. Soon, the enemy forces were falling at the dwarves' feet. Seeing this, the Bear King commanded the sheep army to charge, but Richard was ready. He ordered the troll to use magic to block the advance. The troll cast a spell, and giant trees sprouted up to the clouds, splitting the battlefield in two. The Bear King was enraged by this, but Richard was only getting started. He patted the troll and jumped onto his back. He instructed the troll to cast invisibility on him, then moved stealthily through the trees toward the enemies. The Bear King cursed Richard's cunning, but before he could react, Richard's sword pierced his chest. The Bear King couldn't believe Richard had quietly approached him from behind, using invisibility to deliver a fatal blow. The giant king fell to the ground and died. With their leader dead, everyone on the battlefield froze, staring at Richard in shock. Someone in the crowd shouted that their king had been killed, and chaos erupted. The barbarians took advantage of the confusion, cutting down many enemies as they tried to flee. It was time to press the attack and secure victory. As the vast Waning Moon tribe army retreated in panic, Richard finally felt relieved. He had followed the old saying, "Cut off the snake's head and the body will die." After the fierce battle, the castle was successfully defended, though at a heavy cost. However, the fight had given Richard's men valuable experience. Just as Richard was checking his system panel, Lobby approached him, dressed in full ceremonial attire, with his men. Lobby informed Richard that tonight's full moon was the night they would hold the ceremony to inherit the Titan's power. He explained that this might be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and they had chosen their strongest soldier to attempt the ritual. Lobby hoped their ancestors would bless them tonight, as it was the longest full moon in a century. When the full moon was at its peak, the dwarves jumped into the lake, draining its water before beginning the ceremony. Richard wasn't particularly interested, but out of curiosity and previous agreement with Lobby, he decided to participate. The group made their way underwater, and as the dwarves began casting their spells, the Titan giant, buried beneath the lake, slowly began to rise to the surface. Richard had also brought a shaman and a troll with him, both excited to witness the spell being cast on the massive Titan. As the ceremony commenced, the three strongest dwarf soldiers were chosen to attempt the inheritance of the Titan's power. Lobby swung a stick over his head, trying to fend off the towering figure like a butcher swatting flies. Shaman quickly corrected him, explaining it was a ritual to ward off bad luck, but he wasn't buying it. He questioned whether power inheritance was even reliable. The shaman admitted she wasn't certain, but mentioned that shamanic knowledge is passed down through generations, similar to the dwarves' traditions. Richard questioned the notion that mages could look down on shamans, especially if they possess the 13 secret arts. Shaman calmly explained that it's normal for them to inherit only about half of the arts, noting that even if a successor gains 90% of the knowledge, they might spend their life struggling to master the missing 10%. With the sound of a horn blown by one of the dwarves, flames get lit in a fire circle. Right selected dwarves met the criteria. One commander begs the Titan to have mercy on them, but there is no response. Lobby felt a doom wash over him, but then he remembered that Richard hadn't tried yet. With a frown, he urged Richard to give it a shot. Though Richard didn't take it seriously, he reluctantly agreed and followed the others into the fire circle. As Richard stepped into the circle, something unexpected happened. The fire circle began to glow brightly, illuminating the area with an intense light. The sudden transformation startled Richard, but none more so than the giant figure watching them. The giant's eyes started glowing. Richard had inadvertently triggered something far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The Titan's eyes began to glow with a golden light, growing brighter as if they were about to burst. Midway through, Richard quickly dodged aside. Suddenly, the crowd noticed the silhouette of a creature appearing within the giant's eyes. A creature appears behind the Titan's eye, shattering the Titan's eyes. The cute little divine beast before them was born from the ancient god race inside the Titan giant's body. Richard wondered how his little creature was related to the Titan. Could it have deteriorated because it had been long? This little animal made the dwarves shout "ancestor" in unison. Richard sarcastically tried to show how touched he was by the Titan's ancestor. At the same time, the shaman was more straightforward, immediately suggesting they stew the creature to get some nutrition out of it. Suddenly, the creature cracked out of the Titan's body and leapt, landing with a force that sent shockwaves through the ground, the impact echoing across the land. The sudden movement once again shocks the dwarves. Richard sarcastically comments on the creature's lineage, noting that as a descendant of the Titan, it seems to like staying in high places. He jests that this ensures the Titan didn't have any extramarital affairs. The small creature, whose size matches that of the dwarves, looks up to the onlookers and gets up on the trolls. Its eyes widened as it liked the trolls, and they also couldn't hold back as their eyes widened at the sight of the adorable animal before him. But Richard grabbed the creature to take a closer look and observed that its body had webbed skin between its arm and body, which seemed useful for gliding. The dwarves crowded around eagerly to touch their cute ancestor creature. However, at that moment, Richard suddenly felt that something was wrong. There seemed to be energy about to be released from the creature's body, so he quickly threw it to the group of dwarves. Though the explosion was not fatal, it was strong enough to blow away the dwarves' excitement. Unexpectedly, the little animal had inherited the thunder spell of the Titan race. Richard was both surprised and delighted. One dwarf alerted them about the Titan's unsettlement. The Titan giant, standing in the middle of the lake, seemed to have completed its mission and began to crumble bit by bit, and the dwarf's heart filled with tears to see it. Anyhow, watching the cute creature, Richard named it Sichiu. After countless battles and hard-won victories, Richard makes his way back to his fortress. Sitting with him, Annie asked why he wanted to hurry to the fortress. They hadn't even talked about their condition for cooperation. He replied, just forget about it.
I think you kinda like this video, so just subscribe and like.